Hello everyone, today we talk about the cost effects of the mid-14th century crisis on European farming, so essentially during the second half of the 14th century. So the context is what we have seen many times with the impoverishment of the middle classes and the refeudalization of European politics and society. This is particularly evident in those areas that, in a sense, had achieved a greater, autonomy, which were brought down suddenly by not just by the plague, but as you know, by wars and by natural disasters. I will not digress on the causes and the consequences, connection, because I actually think that this was mostly actively made, right? There was not like an external factor that brought to this fall. Even if this was true, it can even still be seen as a consequence of the previous destabilization of the systems. War is crucial in there. And of course, given that these were pre-industrial societies based on agriculture, overwhelmingly agricultures that were much weaker and fragile as general production systems than today's, with ridiculous crop rates, etc. Even small changes would cause considerable consequences. You can imagine the largest ones, right, and how impacting could be. And in fact, it's almost a paradox if you think about that, because you would expect that with the decline of the areas that had developed mostly with surplus over the years, the country would have somewhat benefited from that. The countryside, the peasantry. Instead, it was the other way around. Right? We will see how, and moral history has a great role in this. Because what we witness in general is the increase of livestock, intensive or specialized cultivations, and this naturally was possible only if you possessed vast surfaces of land or capitals to invest. That went obviously at the advantage of the landed and financial aristocracies that had known how to respond, or were responding at least with greater rapidity and decision to the market requests. This is obviously important because it makes you realize that even though a great part of the crackles invested, as you know, the banking sector, etc., still the amount of capitals in the hands of the aristocracies had, of course, developed the same in a much more sensitive fashion. Let's say that the peasants could actually achieve or understand about the world. That is to say, a banker knew much better what was going on in the world, economically wise, to know where to invest further and how to repair, let's say, the damage deriving from the crack, than a peasant would. Right? We were talking about worlds where naturally the peasantry was not kind of isolated from everything, but still was kind of a pretty miserable reality, and so then also the needs of these people were much more narrowly set, and also their wealth was pretty few. So in general, they lacked the means to reorganize, to reinvent, let's say, their activities differently from the elites. And elites that for this superiority were capable of experimenting new agricultural conceptions and practices, and were instead, in fact, the production remained destined in prevalence to self-consumption, or anchored almost completely to cereal farming, and it wasn't backed by the injection of capitals. The agrarian income stagnated or diminished because of the lesser profit deriving from both the census and the tributes, and also from the sale of cereals. the index price of wheat in England, a country for which some of the most in-depth studies have been carried out, fixed, let's say, in 100 as a quantity in the years 1300, 1319, so before the major crisis. In the 20s of between 1380 and 1399, fell of 65 to get down up to 47 by the 70s, the 80s of the 15th century. So you understand that we're talking about less than a drop of more than 50%, right? And the contemporary increase of the salaries at the same time push the colonists and the tenants to essentially neglect the plots had in concession when they didn't abandon them entirely in order to search for more lucrative income in terms of salaried working labor force, let's say, or for transferring themselves where more favorable working conditions were offered. And not always and everywhere was like this, of course, because the swing of the agrarian and the crop rates and even short times of food shortage could oblige the poorer peasant families to indebt in a serious way in order to cope with the burdens weighing on the plots cultivated by them and to the payment of tributes of public nature. So considering again that the crop rate was somewhat ridiculous, you understand that even one season of harvest that was lost could effectively bring some families to being capable of paying important cannons that connected to their contract on the land they were working, that would bring them to at least to settlements that were much more disadvantageous for them, and hence a much greater subjection of the peasantry, both to privates and the public authority, that very often in this period of reprivatization very often the same, politically speaking, right? So the increasing power of the elites that again had lost an important amount of wealth, but still they owned from the previous centuries an enormous lot, and therefore could and would still manage to monopolize, for example, in times of, for example, of famine, of scarcity, all these things, an important amount of resources at a very low price that would lower again, exactly because the same crisis had triggered also the impoverishment of the same peasantry that worked in order to produce them. So this is, in fact, the general dynamic that we can observe from this example that brought to the establishment, the crystallization of what we know as the Ancien Régime, right? And especially the much greater subjugation, probably of the peasant element to the elites, whether were feudal or urban alike. The princes fundamentally managed to control these masses, to control the grain supplies and production and etc., and could also and would also increase actually their interconnection capacity. That is to say, as we've seen before, for example, the livestock, or even the specialized cultivations, they were things that were enhanced. We made other videos about this. If you go in the medieval economy playlist, you find that. Also, there's something about the countryside and agriculture. That, of course, in the in late medieval Europe, the production actually even increased, right? In spite of the contraction of the demographics, etc. We don't see actually less goods being moved, and this happened through the squeezing, of course, of the working force. And it also happened because the elites that were consolidating power Europe-wide began to exchange, in fact, much higher goods in this sense, much more, for example, luxury products. We've seen silk was, increasing in quality and in quantity, and it's surely something that the peasants didn't trade, and but this can be found again in specialized products for markets that again were mostly directed to the aristocracy, and as a consequence there was a reciprocal support on long range between among the same elites that could produce also what the others in other places lacked, and would in this sense back each other at the expense of the same peasantry. Instead didn't have those same means of connection or international awareness of properly cultural horizons that would make them coordinate with each other. There was no perception of that broadly meant, and thus what we witnessed in the following centuries in Europe is fundamentally it, and it's again, it's not an absolute contraction, especially from an economic point of view, but it's definitely a solidification of the social divides that would remain up to, in fact, the great revolutions of the 18th and 19th century, that in a sense were breaking an order that had formed since the end of the Middle Ages, not much from the feudal times, probably from the late Middle Ages, following this massive collapse that had occurred at the end of the expansive phase of this great medieval civilization, at the end of the 13th, the first half of the 14th century. And that cracked, especially towards the mid-century, with the plague and all. And that reorganized itself on this new basis that, by the way, were quite solid, as you know. As in European history, there is really no the contraction of this great civilization didn't bring to a qualitative contraction of the world at the time. It took an elitistic direction with the Renaissance, etc. But again, it was in fact a time of expansion still, and in part also due to the order that was brought by this new systematization, meaning that the elites now were ever more elites, right? And therefore they knew, in a directional sense, kind of much better than the mess that had occurred in the previous century. This is paradoxical because this is a bit what happened also in the High Middle Ages, in feudal times, what the great expansion of this mass of the same peasantry, of the communes, etc., had stemmed from the vassalic beneficiary, hence aristocratic system that had carried out these huge investments in a more rationalized fashion on a long range scale, etc., that had reactivated the economy in a consistent fashion. The rebirth of the year 1000 was effectively that. And so from the expansion of the system, it was a mess that was represented also in the political fragmentation part of Europe, and this great effort to recompact on kind of more individual cohesive policies. In a sense, it's what we're witnessing today as well. Like, we made this enormous effort, mostly stem not from the elites, but from the spread of technological means, and in part, again, it was the same. Again, yes, it was not much different because the Enlightenment was the product still of the Ancien regime, right? So the masses that were unlocked by this in the last 300 years prospered, but also made a mess that you're witnessing today without regulation, without authority, without discipline, without rationality. And the collapse of the system, again, that we're witnessing is going to bring the elites in control again, and probably they're going to be, at least these elites are qualitatively better than the average person seems to be. I think the elite is in general, right? Until at least it's surpassed by some other powerful force stemming from the bottom. So it's a cycle, if you want, but it's important to recognize the pros and cons of both phases, let's say. Alright, for now we stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. See you next time. Bye.